Zach, we are back diving into ways to dominate our Dynasty Startup drafts. It's Dynasty Startup season. Once again, it is August. It is time to get your Dynasty started off on the right foot. Speaking of starting off on the right foot, we are talking about right off the rip, one of our favorite strategies to talk about. One of the most important, in my opinion, in terms of building value on your rosters and things of that sort. We are still debating over who came up with the terminology first, but we've both deployed the strategy many times in our drafts. What do you got here with the first point? Ways to dominate our dynasty drafts.
Yeah, Bob, we have coined this the inchworm strategy. You think of an inchworm, it moves at very small paces, right? That's what I try to do in my startup drafts. And that being in terms of the context of moving back. I'm a big fan of moving back, but I'm a big fan of moving back only so little. I don't really want to take giant steps back. Let's just put this into context, right? The first round of a startup draft, wherever it may be, I'm letting everybody know that pick is up for sale. And what I'm trying to do is deploy a strategy where I'm moving back into the second round. And that's very valuable because, sometimes you have to engage them in this conversation. I'm giving you 2 top 10 players in a dynasty format. You have to compensate me for that. A lot of times people are like, oh, here's a first round pick. No, that's not commensurate value, especially if we're loading you up now and making that first round pick less valuable. So I want to move back a little bit and I want to be compensated for moving back. Therefore, we call that the inchworm strategy. I do that a lot in my startup drafts. There are some people watching this video rolling their eyes at this very moment because they know that when you're in a startup draft with me, my pick is always for sale. It is always on the block, and I will tag everybody in the group chat and let them know. Now, I don't do this for very long. I let it sit for 10 or 20 minutes. I let people see the text that it's available, let them think about it, and then I make my selection if I'm not moving back. But I really feel that there are specific instances, and we'll talk more about this strategy throughout this video because there are other things that are into this strategy that I don't want to ruin. But I always feel like I can get good value by getting a lesser quality player and something else to boot. And that's what this strategy incorporates. Can I get a Chris Olave plus something else for Jamar Chase? That's what this strategy is. I'm in position to draft Jamar Chase. You want to move up from the second round and take Jamar Chase. All right, well, I'll take a pick in the second round now, and I'll take something on top of that to boot. And we call that the inchworm strategy, Bob.
The one thing that people need to really think about with moving down slowly or, incrementally, small increments, whatever you want to call it, is you can only move down that much once. Otherwise you're having to, come back up or whatever the case is. You only get to move that big gap once. And once you move that span, you can't add value to that pick anymore. You can't, get another rookie pick for next year. You can't get an earlier pick in this draft next year as good as you could have with a move in between that first move. By moving halfway instead of that full distance, you're leaving value on the table, so to speak. So love this point 100%. A strategy I deploy as well to maximize the value I'm taking out of my draft. And I'll dive right on into this next point here, using your tiers. This is why tier-based drafting is so important. And this is a great way to deploy the inchworm strategies, because if you have tiers set up, you want to be drafting at the back end of tiers, because if you have players valued similar value in terms of production and things like that, and then you also have to figure in what your trajectory of your team looks like. But this way you set up your tiers, and then if say your pick lands at the very front end of a tier, hey man, no harm in trading back 3, 4, 5 spots, because I'm going to get a similar valued player, and now I'm going to get some sort of compensation on top and add value to my roster. That's something we'll be saying a lot throughout this video, is adding value to your roster throughout your startup. And that's something that I'll wrap up with a big point at the end. Stay tuned. But absolutely finding ways to use these tiers, have these tiers in place. We talked about it, setting a queue, just having some way to have this thing managed more easily than having to reference multiple platforms to see where your queue and things like that are set up and your rankings are set up. Finding ways to navigate down the draft board between the tiers, just more ways you can add value and pack value onto your roster. I will say too, we are both very avid fans of trading down, but there will be times where trading up makes a lot of sense, in the point of, if you see a tier fading away and then your pick kind of lands in a pool of where you really need a running back, let's say, and we don't want to reach down the board to fill a need. We want to make sure we're filling the need with the best value, best player available. But let's say you can trade up 3 more picks to get into that tier where a running back makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense to do, because getting that running back, value-wise making sense is a good way to, why you have these tiers in place is to make sure you're making informed decisions throughout your draft, as opposed to just kind of looking at the board and seeing what looks cool and thinking you can wait on this player to fall 5 picks. This kind of takes the guesswork out of it and gives you the ability to, I should say, work your way down on the board that makes sense to getting the players you want, that makes sense for your team build, so on and so forth. Zach, feel free to touch on this or dive into your next point.
Yeah, so my next point ties into kind of both of what we're talking about thus far, right? And I kind of want to put a bow on it at the end. For me, after the first few rounds, I would say the first 3-4 rounds, which is pretty much where I'm going best player available, what players can I draft that if a redraft were to happen a year from now would be drafted much higher than they were at this point? Great examples of this last year. Trevor Lawrence, he was a 4th round quarterback, I think, last year, and now he's a top 10 pick. Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave. A lot of times this is like the incoming rookies as well, because there's a lot of uncertainty about the rookies, and so they go 4th, 5th, 6th round. And some of those rookies will improve their stocks. Some of their stocks will fall a little bit, like a Treylon Burks, which is maybe something you could take advantage of. But what players can I draft now that in a year from now will be drafted much higher? Now, the thing I want to kind of tie this all together, Bob, is when I'm employing the inchworm strategy, I'm for the most part, they are not leagues that I am going into a year one trying to win. What I am trying to do is set myself up to be competitive. And I might make a playoff spot. I might not. I had one league where I did this very well. I was the last team not in the playoffs, but I also had someone else's 101. So now I have a fringe playoff team. It had Trevor Lawrence on it. And now I just added Bijan Robinson to a team that just missed the playoffs. And that's what I'm trying to do here. Because I'm not trying to set myself up for 1 year. I'm trying to set myself up for 5 years. Because for the most part, teams that win championships have players that are at the peak of their prime. And I'm trying to build a championship dynasty roster with players that are at the start of their prime or haven't even gotten there yet. And how do I do that? I do that by drafting players that right now are a value, because next year they will be drafted much higher. So it's, all this ties together, and I want to make sure that we let people know, Bob, there is a chance that you're not uber competitive in year one, and I'm okay with that, because I'm in Dynasty for the long term. I'm trying to win your money multiple years, not just one.
I love this point because it's another way that we're packing on value. And like I said, that'll be a term that's thrown around a lot in this video, especially by me. You're finding ways to get players on your roster that are just kind of naturally going to, outside of, God forbid, an injury, an unlikely down season, things like that. These players are just going to naturally accrue value. Like we talk about with getting future rookie picks. They're just going to naturally increase in value. And if you're avoiding having players that are just completely falling off a cliff on your roster, this means you're maintaining value, and your value bank is something I'll touch on later, will just naturally increase and just keep going over time. If you're able to just keep adding value to your roster, value being assets in general, players that are producing, players that are ascending in production, whatever the case is, if you're able to do that repetitively, like you said, Zach, and not necessarily be a year one focused team, that's not something we really beat the drum for on this channel. I don't think that's something we both agree that we're generally trying to build for the long term. There's absolutely arguments to be made about winning year one, because I believe it's the easiest year to win because everything is so spread out for the most part. There's not a lot of disparity. Everything's pretty even keel. If you can find yourself an edge somewhere along the way, you're probably in the best shape you can possibly be in. But if you do want to go long term, leveling things out, trading back, adding these assets, and building on value like we've discussed is a huge way to do it. And I love this point, like you said, because just finding ways to wisely grab players that are just likely to increase in value. Like you said, Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Trevor Lawrence, we could all say that last year. Well, in hindsight, it's like, wow, there's no way you could know that. And it's like, well, honestly, both receivers that you mentioned, very highly drafted. Trevor Lawrence was the 101 in his draft year, coming off a terrible year with Urban Meyer. Gets Dougie P in the mix. I don't know why we call him Dougie P on this channel. Everywhere else, I think, just calls him Doug Peterson, but that's fine. In all honesty, just all signs should have pointed to these guys' value just going up. And if you're able to do that every single draft year or whenever you do your startup draft, you'll be in good shape. Moving on to my next point, and this is just more about getting the value on your roster. I'm talking about soaking up value on proven bets. Every single draft you're in, unless somebody is playing it like a redraft league, which is, I would say, somewhat rare. I think usually, even if people are new, they usually default to, now I'm going to go draft all the young players. But that's exactly what leaves these proven bets on the board. And that doesn't mean guys that are 29, 30, 31, 32 necessarily. There are going to be guys that are 26, 27, 28 that are going to be values, especially at wide receiver, at running back, guys that have not quite hit that cliff yet, of guys that, running backs right now, I would say, are probably some of the most supreme values, especially those guys like Dalvin Cook, Joe Mixon. I'd say DeAndre Swift has some. And I'm not saying I love these guys. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that they're probably being drafted later than what their production would suggest. And why I'm saying to soak up the value on guys like this, and receivers like Amari Cooper, Terry McLaurin, guys that aren't being drafted in that higher up tier, that top 15, barely top 20 type guys. Getting these guys on your roster, whether you're competitive or not, and something we discussed in the mistakes video, is just getting points on your roster. And the reason for that is, at the end of the day, there will be competitive teams who want points on their roster. So even if your first season or doesn't go according to plan, whether you were trying to compete or not, you have value on your roster with these players. And now the reason I say that is because I think to some people, their value is going to increase, particularly those competitive teams. And this is similar to what you're trying to do with where are they going to be in a startup next year. I think these players are probably going to be possibly even lower in a startup next year. But I think we'll have sort of a bell curve effect where their value is going to go up because people want them to score points on their team. And I think that the worst thing you can do is, because at the beginning of drafts, it's very heavy in terms of young, up and coming, and somewhat established talent. That's what the top parts of drafts are. And then you get into this kind of mix where we still have some aging vets, but they're still somewhat young, like Christian McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley are kind of in that mix of running backs that kind of trickle in with like wide receivers like Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, and JSN a few, maybe a round later, kind of in that odd mix. And then you get into where you can fall into just going after young players more, these rookies that are incoming, whose value can certainly increase, but there's going to be veterans there kicking around that can provide you a lot more points this season. So especially if you're trying to compete year one, go after that year one win like we discussed. And if it doesn't pan out, maybe you have some injuries, whatever the case is, you change your mind and decide, hey, it's time to rebuild. You have valuable assets on your team because they're putting up points in season. And when it's in season, points are going to matter. Picks aren't going to matter as much. You can toss your hat in the arms race with these proven vets. Just a thought, something I want to do in my drafts, especially if I am trying to kind of put myself, like you said, where you're, hey, I might compete, I might not. These are guys that kind of give you the avenue to go both ways, possibly if you choose to do so. But Zach, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Otherwise, feel free to dive on into your next point.
Yeah, I like this point. There's a couple of good players that specifically come to mind. Like you mentioned, Christian McCaffrey. I'll go a little bit later down the draft board. We can go Mike Williams. We can go Juju Smith-Schuster. These are players that have proven that they can score points before and that are values where they're being drafted. And worst comes to worst, you don't make the playoffs that year or you don't see yourself as a contender, they will have value to someone else. Mm-hmm. They're not 31 years old. They're not Adam Thielen. These are still players in their 20s. So I like this point because, like you said, you'll start to see this once you get close to the double digits, 8th round, 9th round. You'll see these players still available, and you're like, maybe I should take one of these guys instead of, a younger player that hasn't proven anything thus far. So I really, really like this point. For me, Bob, we've talked a lot about trading picks, but there is a philosophy when I am trading draft picks. If I'm trading picks in a startup draft, Bob, I am making sure to get another pick in the startup draft. I see this way too often, and it makes no sense. You do not trade out of a startup draft. I never trade out of a startup draft. I always trade down in a startup draft because I need to fill out my roster. And I'm not doing it with guys that are available on the waiver wire after 30 rounds of drafts. So I need to fill out my roster. Plus, if you think about it, it's going to have somebody else's roster have too many players, right? So you could, that's the way you could sell it. Like, hey, you're going to have to drop a player anyways. Now, I am trying to get close to, again, we always talk about inchworm strategy. I'm not going from the 6th round to the 15th round. That's not inchworming. I'm going from the 6th to the 7th, 6th to the 8th. Where do I see these tiers that you talked about earlier, Bob? Where do I see there being a drop-off that I don't want to miss out on? So I'm never trading out, and I'm always trading down, Bob.
Question: Do you have that same belief when you're like, beyond the 20th round and you're able to get like a 3rd round pick? Are you willing to trade out then for something like that?
Yeah, for
No?
sure. Of course.
Okay.
Of course at that point. But, this video is not for that purpose. This video is not for the 20th rounds of the startup draft. This video is, the difference maker rounds of your draft. And for that, I need to have a pick back. I'll go from the 10th to the 3rd. Here's another thing that I do, right? Like, for example, I'm trading back, or, a lot of these trades, Bob, involve other startup picks. They don't always involve future picks. What if I can move up in 2 rounds later in the draft, right? So a lot of times what I try to do is fill the gap. Like, what round am I missing a pick in? Am I missing a pick in the 12th round? All right, I'll move back from the 6th to the 7th. You give me your 12th and I'll give you my 15th. Fill in the gaps of where I'm missing picks. So again, don't trade out of the startup draft. Figure out a way to trade back. If you can stay close, stay close. But if not, fill the gaps of where you don't have picks in your startup draft.
I love this. This is something where if, for whatever reason, I create a gap early on in the draft. Let's say I moved a 9th round pick to move up, or it was some kind of trade where I just lost my 9th round pick. Something I really like doing is I trade down early in drafts. 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th round, whatever the case is. I'll trade down and I might lose that round because I trade down a couple times, whatever the case is. Then when I have this opening in, let's say, the 9th, 8th, 10th round even, I'll use the picks after that to trade back into that 10th round or trade back into that 9th round. And then I'll just kind of let that gap keep being there. And then I'll just trade back up into the gap. Because what happens here is I want to pack my roster with as many, if it's a start 10, I want to have as many picks in the top 10 rounds as I can. To start 11, same, however many start it is, I want to pack that many rounds with picks as much as I can and move up my draft board. And then, ideally my gap picks end up being like the 27th through 30th rounds where I'm, hey guys, that was a fun 26 rounds. You guys have fun with the last 4 rounds. I'm going to chill here now and go think about how I can improve this team beyond this draft. But that was kind of a side point. I had that point on here, oddly enough, earlier, but you brought it up, and I think it's a great point too. I hate going multiple rounds without picks. I like being on a bookend, and then you're arguably waiting 2 rounds to make picks then. But I hate even more just not having a pick in a round, except oddly enough, the first one. But you get so much value moving off of that pick for the future in that draft in general. That moving that first pick is one that helps set up a catalyst to filling those first 10 rounds to fill your starting lineup at some point. So great point, Zach. All about it, finding ways to manipulate the board like that and keep picks on your roster. Except for the late rounds, we'll trade those for 3rd and 4th round picks or whatever the case is, future picks. We don't care as much about those picks.
I just did a startup draft the other day, right? And, you just said, hey, if I have to start 10, I want to make sure I have 10 players. I do it a little bit deeper. And I'll give you an example. In this startup draft, to start 10, in the first 12 rounds, I had 14 picks in the first 12 rounds. I still picked up a 1st round pick next year, 3 2nd round picks in 2024. Again, 14 players in a start 10 in the first 12 rounds. And I only had 2 picks in the first 5 rounds. I was still able to fill my roster with adequate talent that belongs in the starting roster. Because again, first 12 rounds, I mean, in the start 10, everybody's generically filling their rosters. And depending on the format, if it's quarterback, you're hopefully getting 3 quarterbacks, not just 2. So I was able to fill my roster adequately, provide some depth, and give myself flexibility in the rookie draft next year. I can move those picks. I can use those picks in the rookie draft. I can use them to trade after the startup draft, in a point we'll talk about later. So I just like you said, try to get, if it start 10, try to get 10 players in the first 9 rounds. See if you can do that by manipulating the draft board.
Love that mindset. Just stock your top picks with whatever the start is. Stock those picks as much as you can, because especially when it's a deeper draft, having that strong depth throughout that you can also replace during when there's bye weeks, injuries, whatever the case is, huge, especially down the stretch. So moving on to this next point, and I've touched on this a little bit earlier when we're talking about tiers specifically, is always drafting best player available or best value available. Do not draft to fill a lineup. If you are looking to have to reach down the board to fill your running back 2 slot, or even your running back 1 slot if you punted it that long, whatever the case is, if you're having to look down the board to fill a slot, trade that pick down, or find another way to draft just a good player that's a good value at that spot and then trade for a tight end later. Whatever the case is, find a way to take the best player available off the board or the best value off the board, whatever player is deemed to be most valuable by the market. Take that player off the board, take the best player off the board. Do not draft to fill a lineup. That is how you get into trouble, because the second you click select or draft on that player and they're not worth the draft slot that you took them in, immediate value loss. And it's hard to get that value back unless you do everything else right. It's just 1, it's maybe 2, maybe 3 times. Just that much lose you a ton of value on your draft and on your team. So draft the best player available, trade for need later. Don't worry about drafting with needs in mind to fill your lineup gaps. Worry about that after the draft, trading these best player availables, best values available that we added. Zach, feel free to touch on this or dive on into your next point.
Well, this is where your tiers come into play, right? Because if you don't have these predetermined tiers, you're just relying on the sleeper or whatever app's ADP. And you're going, who's Cam Akers is at the top of the ADP, but Jameson Williams is 15 picks later, and he's only there because he got suspended 6 games. Let's be real. Jameson Williams' ADP should be higher. And I'm giving you a hypothetical. I don't know if this is true. I'm just giving you a hypothetical. It's happened before. Make sure that you have those tiers predetermined and you're not relying on the sleeper ADP to determine your tiers. It's a very important point that, we keep harking on our older points here in this video, Bob.
Hey, it happens. It's called synergy. Feel free to dive on into your next point, Zach.
This point for me, Bob, is not, I would say, universally agreed upon, and it just works for me. But for me, I like to diversify my fantasy team. I really try, for the most part, to avoid stacking players that are not quarterback and position player. Like, I don't want a running back and a wide receiver from the same team. I don't want a tight end and a running back from the same team. I want to diversify. This is, hypothetically, a 12-team league, start 10. There's 120 players. We can find diversity there that works for us. Now, and I will say, like Joe Burrow and T. Higgins, all right, that's cool. That's fine. But then you start to get into these situations where now you're stacking multiple positions. And I don't want to do that, right? And I used the Bengals offense here. In my recent startup draft, it was a 1.75 premium tight end premium league. I punted tight end because everyone was reaching on tight ends. I'm like, I'll go get one later. I ended up looking at the tight ends, and I was targeting Irv Smith. It's a high risk, low risk, high reward move, right? Is that how you say it?
Sure.
Low risk, high reward.
Sure.
Low risk, high reward with Irv Smith. All right. I grabbed a couple of other tight ends, but Irv Smith was a tight end I was kind of targeting later in the draft. So for me, I'm not trying to get Joe Burrow and Joe Mixon and Irv Smith. I don't want 3 players on one offense. Now, you will say that's a good offense to have 3 players on, and I will agree with you. And that may work for you in the regular season, in your fantasy season. That'll work for you. You'll probably end up with 8, 9, 10 wins, and that's great. But there is a high probability that one of those 3 games in your playoffs, those 3 are not going to do it for you. And that's 30% of your starting lineup. And I don't want that problem. I would rather be risk adverse here and not have 3 players from one offense on my team. If I can avoid it, even 2 players from one offense. Because let's say the Cincinnati Bengals get shut out in week 15. That's really bad for you. So I'm trying to, again, diversify my assets. So if one player has a bad game, I won't have multiple players from that offense. Again, not a lot of people agree. And I think this is a little bit more in depth in terms of the startup strategy, but this is what I try to do. I'm not trying to stack multiple weapons from one offense on my team, Bob.
Yeah, I'm with you here. I've never been real in on that concept either. Like I'm happy, like you kind of mentioned, stacking a quarterback with a wide receiver, a tight end, a running back. If it happens, cool. I'm not gonna try to make that happen. That stack isn't as fun to talk about in league circles, but I'm with you on this because the last thing you want is to have a bad week, like you mentioned, and this whole offense is just you're hoping on yardage at that point, and yardage, receptions, whatever the case is, you know, not great. And if they're not scoring touchdowns, the yardage probably isn't awesome either. You know, if they're getting, if they're shut out, they're probably not getting to a point where they're, working their way down the field very much and not
Right,
getting much
yeah.
yardage racked up. So I'm with you on this. I don't think it's too hot of a take or anything like that where, it's wrong to think on. I think there's a point where you shouldn't necessarily avoid the value when it's given and things like that. But I think this is a point where, if anything, you take a player, if it's a good value, say, let's say you had Jamar Chase already, but T. Higgins becomes a screaming value later. He's like the tight end 16 off the board when he's more like the tight end 9 or 10 right now. You kind of got to take T. Higgins at that point, most likely, and then just find a trade for him later, something like that. I think is the next, roundabout way to work your way through that. If you end up drafting these guys or finding them at good values, whatever the case may be, I think that's the better way to do it than avoiding them. Not that you said that, but I'm 100% in agreement. I don't want to go into my season with, a cluttered roster. Like, oddly enough, you bring up the Bengals. I know two insane Bengals fans who will just try to get all of the Bengals on their roster. Whoever the Bengals have trotting out there that week, like them saying that, like they're bad players or anything like that. But whoever the Bengals have in their offense, there are, whether it's kickers, defense, if you're playing IDP, whatever the offensive players are, they want them on their roster, plain and simple. That's like the extreme version of this. I understand, but I'm in agreement. I want to diversify as well. I don't want to have, similar players because I don't want to be locked into a possible down offense one week when it matters most.
And again, this will work out for you in the regular season more times than not. You'll probably go 10-4 at running that offense out there 14 weeks, but you're trying to win 3 games in a row from week 15 to week 17. And that is the part of the NFL season where it's crunch time for a lot of these teams. And if they have one bad performance, you've put yourself in a very hard situation to win in a very high stakes game for you in what should be your fantasy playoffs.
And I think too, if you do end up with these guys, then I think the discussion becomes moving somebody out of the mix by the time of your trade deadline, if there is one, to ensure that you don't have this sort of liability.
Mm-hmm.
And you can move off these guys at good values. Like, none of these guys are getting you pennies on the dollar at any point. So you'd always look to move in different situations. That's just, more strategy for down the road, I think. Moving on to the last point, and what I want to do, all encompassing, what I want to do with my dynasty draft, my startup draft in particular, is I want to maximize the value I obtain through trades, whatever the case is, maximize the value you obtain to your roster throughout your entire draft. Ways to do this: talk about trading down, picking best players available instead of reaching down the board and things like that, avoiding mistakes, whatever the case is. But I want you to think of your roster as a bank of sorts, and we'll call it a value bank. This is an idea I've been kind of workshopping in my brain over the time. But throughout the entirety of your startup draft, we want to fill it with as much value as possible. There's only so much value to go around a league. You figure players, picks, whatever the case is, startup picks, all of the things. At the end of the draft, since there's only so much value to go around, we want to end up with as much value as possible, and ideally the largest abundance of value on our roster as opposed to anywhere else in the league. And this can boil down to, as I mentioned, rookie picks, young ascending players, established producers, whatever the case is. Value is what we want, whatever that value boils down to. So if we can shift value from opposing rosters in the league to our roster wisely throughout the draft process by trading down wisely, using our tiers, trading down in small increments, using the inchworm strategy, multiple times in the same round, even if possible, if we have an early pick in that round, picking up that veteran value when it's given, and avoiding unnecessary risks and, crazy mistakes along the way, as we've discussed in other videos, you will end up with a crazy amount of value on your roster. Like you discussed, you were able to pack your starting lineup with 14 starters in the first 12 rounds. and still have a ton of draft capital banked up for the future. It's moves like that and things like that that put you in the driver's seat going forward, because you know as well as I do, Zach, that rookie value that you have accrued on that roster is going to build as the season wears on, and especially once the season ticks over. Rookie value immediately goes up. You're in the driver's seat for what you can trade those picks for to make your team more competitive possibly next year, and turn that thing around very quickly and get those more elite assets on your roster, because you're able to trade first round picks at a premium value, because, well, rookie picks are the fun thing now. Speaking of, you did a good job increasing your value bank through your draft, as far as I can tell. So that is the main thing that I want to do with all of this. Everything that goes into your draft is about just getting everything onto your roster as much as you can. Try to take, it's the one point where everything is on the table, and it's the one point where you have the best opportunity to take as much as you can from the table.
I think this is what we're both saying, just in different ways, right?
Yeah.
By all the different strategies that we've kind of imposed throughout this video. And it's definitely a different way to approach your startup drafts, because like we said earlier, you may not win the first year. And we want to encourage you. Like, I'm very much all about winning fantasy championships, but I also want to win a lot of them. I want to win 2 in a row, 3 in a row, 4 in a row. And the way that you set yourself up by implementing some of these strategies. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't go back retroactively, which we'll talk about in another video of what things to do after the draft, but during your startup draft, you can really set yourself up in a way that another team is not. And that's for multiple years to come, and then creating a value bank. Like you said, these picks that I've acquired, they're not going to ever be less valuable than they were when I traded for them. They will only gain more value as time progresses. Now, the hard part about that is patience. We will talk about that in another video as well. But I love this point, because this is what we've been trying to say in different ways. I love the value bank. Like, we need a T-shirt with the value bank, and we need a T-shirt with the inchworm strategy, because we need to start trademarking ourselves around here. But this is a great point, Bob. I totally agree, and I love it. Yeah.